B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, July 19th, 2019, 7/19/19. Some people like that kind of numerological lineup. And as we head into a blistering weekend where much of the country is facing a massive heat wave, temperatures expected to hit 100 degrees in many areas, I hope you hunker down, keep plenty of water, and work your way through it. Of course, has nothing to do with climate change, nothing at all. So as I sat down, news broke that in the Straits of Hormuz, Iran has apparently taken control of a British oil tanker it has accused of vaguely violating maritime rules and regulations. Now, there was an incident earlier this week where a vessel was shepherded into an Iranian port, and that appeared to be a vessel that needed some mechanical attention. So I don't want to overemphasize this because it is a breaking story. We don't know the dimensions, and we don't know if this is a political provocation or if this 30,000-ton British-flagged ship, which was heading for Saudi Arabia, did actually violate maritime regulations. Now, that is in context with recent events over the last 24 hours. Yesterday at the White House, Trump, as he was trying to backpedal from the mob scene in North Carolina the night before, he announced that a drone of the Iranians had been destroyed by U.S. forces. They claim that a small drone came within 1,000 yards of a U.S. amphibious assault ship that is in the Persian Gulf right now, allegedly in international waters, and I hope that's the case. What is interesting is that Iran said all of our drones returned to base safely, and we have not lost a drone to the Americans. The implication is that the U.S. Navy used jamming devices to confuse the drone's navigation system, causing it to crash and fall out of the sky. So that's a little bit of a dispute that's underway right now. But behind all this appears to be an initiative from hardliners in Iran to, unfortunately, in my view, reward the bad behavior of Donald Trump by offering to engage in direct talks with the United States. Now, this is surfacing at a time when tensions are very high. Clearly, the U.S. sanctions are pinching the Iranians, and I'm sorry to see that they are responding by offering these direct talks. And the source is from an interview with the New York Times of, do you remember this guy? Former Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Now, he was a guy who was in power during the last part of the George W. Bush administration, and he had a lot of bombast, was a very provocative guy, and he lost and he was the winner of what is described as a suspiciously lopsided victory about 10 years ago. He has more recently been banned from running for office, but he has a high-ranking position on some of the councils in Iran, and this follows on comments that the foreign minister has made, Javad Zarif. Now, he had said that in the past there could be no new negotiations unless the U.S. rejoined the nuclear agreement that Trump bailed from last year. But on Thursday, Zarif said he was willing to meet with American senators to discuss possible ways out of the nuclear crisis. And for the first time, Zarif floated modest steps that Tehran would be willing to take in return for the simultaneous lifting of sanctions that Trump has reimposed. Now, John Bolton, of course, appears to still have Trump's ear on policy toward Iran, and it's hard to imagine at the moment that the U.S. will respond favorably to this. Trump appears to be intent on trying to decimate the power structure in Iran, And I fear that these concessions at this point will only encourage him to pursue a very hard line. And of course, we know that that is done at the bidding of Benjamin Netanyahu and the extreme right-wing government of Israel. Over at Consortium News today, our friend, retired Army Colonel Ann Wright, who, of course, is quite the activist, she published a piece noting that generals, ambassadors, security experts, church leaders, and Nobel Prize laureates all say no war with Iran. And I think it's a timely piece. The tireless Ann Wright was on my Facebook feed just an hour or two ago, live from Chicago, protesting at the Israeli consulate there, and later protesting at the headquarters of the Boeing Corporation. She never rests, at least not that I can tell. And I appreciate the piece that she's published. It's linked to in the show file for today's podcast, so you can take a look. Now to the domestic squabble. Yesterday I told you how Trump was gaslighting many of his followers, and it appears that his daughter Ivanka encouraged him to backpedal and separate himself from his mob that chanted, "Send her back," echoing the ugly tweets that he had been insisting on posting over the preceding days. And just 2 hours after he said, well, I don't agree with that, and I wish they hadn't done that, he falsely claimed that he had tried to stop them, when in fact he waited a full 13 seconds as they chanted, "Send her back" 8 more times after he finished his latest attack line on Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. So 2 hours after that, Trump tweeted about the mob, "These are people that love our country. I want them to keep loving our country. And I think the congresswomen, by the way, should be more positive than they are." Now, this is pure and simple demagoguery. Trump is defining his sense of loving our country based on slavish submission and approval of his incoherent and irrational policies. And so this, gives you a little bit of whiplash, but it shows that Trump is a compulsive liar. And despite the fact that he changes his story, within 2 hours, there are millions of people who are buying what he's selling on a daily basis. New York Times did a fact check on the allegations that Trump made at the North Carolina mob rally on Wednesday night, and as you can imagine, it's bullshit. He, for example, picked up on a rumor that Ilhan Omar was married to her brother. He immediately said, "I know nothing about it." But he, of course, spread the rumor and then tried to distance himself from it. This is a kind of ritual that he engages in. And to that story, by the way, it's complicated. Ilhan Omar married a guy and divorced him, married another guy and divorced him, and then reconnected and remarried the first guy, who appears to be the father of her 3 children. And some of the marriages went through a religious divorce. I don't know all these details, but the claim that she is married to her brother appears to be completely false. And while the Minneapolis papers have tried to get clarification, it does appear that Congresswoman Omar is not providing that. So I can't evaluate that. But on another issue, Trump claimed that Omar blamed the United States for the crisis in Venezuela. And all she did was appear on Democracy Now! At the time of the estimate that 40,000 Venezuelans had died in the past year as the result of American sanctions. And her quote, "A lot of the policies that we've put in place have kind of helped lead the devastation in Venezuela. And we've sort of set the stage for where we are arriving today. This particular bullying and the use of sanctions to eventually intervene and make regime change really doesn't help the people of countries like Venezuela, and it certainly doesn't help and is not in the interest of the United States." That is a very rational comment. And Trump should take another look at his own policies, because he's kind of moved on from trying to promote Juan Guaido as the next illegitimate leader of Venezuela, and the people are suffering as the sanctions just ruin the economy there. And the Maduro government is hanging on. I think it will for the foreseeable future. But the callousness of the United States to promote regime change and then just kind of move on and let people languish in deep suffering, well, it shows that their claims of humanitarian interest to begin with were bullshit. I am stunned by this. I'm holding in my hands a printout from a New York Times article. Just since Trump's tweet on Sunday or Monday that the 4 Democratic congresswomen should go back to where they came from, 16,000 readers of the New York Times have shared their experiences being told to go back. And I understand that this goes on a regular basis, but it's stunning and really devastating when you hear these accounts. Here's Justin Vasquez of Irvine, California. I was 12 the first time I heard that. My mom and I were at Costco Christmas Eve, there to pick up a ham. By the time we made it to the register, the lines were huge. A middle-aged white woman tried cutting in line. My mom stopped her, and when she did, the woman said, "Get out of line and go back to Mexico." Here's another. This is an individual from Texas. I'm American, born and raised in Texas. I'm also Muslim and South Asian. In middle school, a boy yelled at me to go home. He stood up. Apparently, this person accidentally dropped a textbook on the foot of a boy, who then said, "What's wrong with you? Go home, you dirty." And the person wouldn't repeat the epithet that was used there. And so here's another one. When I was in 7th grade, this is a woman named Margot Luna. I commented to some classmates that I didn't like cheeseburgers. One of them, a white girl, turned to me and said, "You're not American. Go back to Mexico." Well, she was born in Albuquerque. She is not of Mexican descent, but she does not have pure white skin color. And with a surname like Luna, people simply assumed her ethnicity. And I rarely cite David Brooks, the milquetoast, old-school Republican op-ed columnist for the New York Times, who also does commentary on the public TV NewsHour. But his column grabbed my attention today. The headline, "Donald Trump Hates America." And he enumerates. In Trump's version, American is defined by 3 propositions. First, to be American is to be xenophobic. The basic narrative he tells is that the good people of the heartland are under assault from aliens, elitists, and outsiders. Second, to be American is to be nostalgic. America's values were better during some golden past. And third, a true American is white. White Protestants created this country. Everybody else is here on their sufferance. And he says Trump's vision is radically anti-American. The real American idea is not xenophobic, nostalgic, or racist. It is pluralistic, future-oriented, and universal. Now, he does promote a lot of the gibberish of American exceptionalism, the myth of the American dream. But his central point, I consider to be quite accurate. Every day I pause for a minute to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. And today we mention Suzanne Bowen, Stuart Russell, Brian Mazzy, and Andrew Rush. They each kick in $10, $20 a month, in some cases $5 a month, and you can do it too. All you have to do is visit peterbcollins.com, click on Menu, click on Become a Subscriber. You land on the sign-up page, and in seconds you can make a choice of the level of support that's comfortable for you and your budget. Take out a new annual subscription, supply a mailing address in the continental U.S., and I'll send you a bonus book. 2001, The Dystopian Utopia. It's a blueprint for survival from climate change. And it's a very powerful book, and I'd be happy to send you a copy with your new annual subscription. Well, the Jeffrey Epstein case continues to get a lot of attention. And we're still seeing that the corporate media is focusing entirely on Epstein's connections to Donald Trump. But there were a lot of other people who rode his Lolita Express to his private Virgin Island where they partied with underage girls. And one of the people who I respect, who has been relentless in digging into pedophile scandals is reporter Nick Bryant. And he kind of went quiet after Gawker, where he had been publishing, was run out of business by Peter Thiel and by friends of Bubba the Love Sponge, that bizarre case. But Nick Bryant remains a very solid, credible source, and he has possession of Jeffrey Epstein's black book. It's filled with people's names like Donald Trump. Bill Clinton has some 20 entries in the book, different phone numbers and contact people. Ehud Barak, who is in contention, I believe, to challenge Netanyahu in the rerun of the Israeli election. Actor Alec Baldwin and actor Ralph Fiennes. Mick Jagger, Courtney Love. They're all listed in that book. And when Nick Bryant tried to get a major publication to take his story, he found no takers. And I want to credit Vanity Fair for conducting an interview with Bryant. I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast. And they even allow him to talk about the Franklin scandal. That was where kids from Boys Town in Omaha, Nebraska, were trafficked into Washington, D.C. to parties that included powerful individuals in the first Bush administration. And he makes some interesting comparisons between the Franklin scandal and the current Epstein scandal. And he predicts that many prominent people could go down in this burgeoning scandal. Will they be able to contain it? Will the damage be limited to Trump? I have a hard time believing that. And when will the corporate media stop protecting Bill Clinton? And Alan Dershowitz, for that matter. We have another sex scandal story. You may have heard of George Nader. He is a Lebanese-American who was prominent in the Trump campaign. He arranged that meeting in the Seychelles Islands between Eric Trump and some Russian official that has raised a lot of eyebrows from Russiagate promoters. And he also was trying to cash in as an advisor to the United Arab Emirates, promoting business deals that would enrich him. And he has a history, a whole history of sex offenses with boys and underage persons. He has pleaded not guilty, and he was denied bail. And so most recently, he was arrested at JFK, and authorities allege that he carried child pornography when he arrived in the country from Dubai in January of 2018. And Mueller examined his phone, and apparently that's where some of these images of, young sexual targets showed up. He also was convicted in the past of sex offenses of this type. And I want to reference, I had a chance to complete Whitney Webb's lengthy first installment in her series about Jeff Epstein. And it's fascinating to look at the history of sexual blackmail. And she links it to some of the Prohibition-era figures, then to Roy Cohn, Donald Trump's good friend, and a really, really creepy figure from the 1950s and 60s, and even J. Edgar Hoover, and some of the parties where the very powerful FBI director who blackmailed other people with their sexual proclivities. And he showed up at various parties in drag and dallying with young male sex partners. That's how it is described. I expect part 2 of Whitney Webb's piece to be published next week over at Mint Press News. And today I'm releasing a fresh in-depth interview as an audio and video podcast. The video comes from my local TV show here in Marin County, and this week I interviewed Mark Shapiro. He is a longtime environmental journalist, first covered the issue of America's seed stock, the world's seed stock, going back almost 30 years when he wrote a piece for Mother Jones magazine. His new book is called Seeds of Resistance, and in this excerpt you hear him talk about the rapid rate of consolidation of corporate control of more than half of the world's seed stocks. Here's Mark Shapiro.
The consolidation of the seed industry from the days that I was first there, which is, we're talking like the 80s, and it was already beginning, which is what I think I was one of the first people to write about it, at least in a kind of more popular magazine. And since that time, the consolidation has really accelerated, like beyond a level that anyone could have imagined. And that was spurred forward by the tightening of patent laws, which one after another, and I of course described this in my book, one after another, the Supreme Court decided to strengthen the ability of companies to patent living organisms. You know, before the mid 80s, you could not go patent a living organism. You could not go patent something that actually changes generation to generation. It changes subtly, you know, like a living organism changes in subtle ways. But suddenly, due to a couple of Supreme Court decisions in the 80s, you could suddenly patent living organisms. And that's what the seed companies, which later became chemical companies, began doing one after another. Mm-hmm. And it was that which encouraged the radical consolidation of the seed industry.
That's journalist Mark Shapiro. Again, his new book is called Seeds of Resistance. You can hear the full interview. The link, the podcast will be posted following this podcast at peterbcollins.com and most of our audio outlets. And in both today's News and Comment podcast and in the Shapiro podcast, you'll find a link to the video if you prefer to absorb it in that manner. Interesting study from a graduate student at Columbia University. His name is Richard McAlexander, and he has done a deep dive on the linkage between immigration and terrorism. And what he discovers is that immigration into Western countries leads to more terrorism, but not by immigrants or people sympathetic to them. It is from right-wing nationalist extremists. And this pattern shows up in Germany, Belgium, France, Greece, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, and the United Kingdom. And I think it is quite applicable here as well. The federal judge with the consolidated opioid cases in Cleveland ordered release of some critical information this week, and we learned that in a 7-year period, Big Pharma in this country pumped out 76 billion opioid pills. Now, number one, this is a huge, huge hit to the image of Barack Obama. How he and his administration failed to address this crisis as hundreds of thousands of Americans died from drug-related overdoses during his 2 terms. And I also want to point out that earlier this week we saw a lot of news coverage of the life sentence issued to the Mexican drug lord El Chapo. And as I pointed out, I don't have any great sympathy for El Chapo. But the white-collar drug lords who killed hundreds of thousands of Americans and profiteered on 76 billion opioid pills that they knew were highly addictive, the Sackler family in particular, the people who run McKesson, the nation's largest pharmaceutical distributor based here in San Francisco, they're all at large. And while the Sackler family has had to cough up some financial damages over the last few years, they still have their freedom. And I don't think you can claim that El Chapo was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans. The comparison simply doesn't work. Kevin McAleenan is the acting Secretary of Homeland Security, and he took a pummeling on Capitol Hill yesterday before the House Oversight and Reform Committee. Elijah Cummings, the chair, and a Democrat from Maryland, hammered him about the children sitting in their own feces. None of us would have our children in that position. They are human beings. AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, asked him, "Did you see the images of officers circulating photoshopped images of my violent rape?" She also asked if the officers who had made offensive posts in the Facebook group were still caring for migrants at the border. And Republicans, of course, blame Democrats for all this. And it is their intransigence where the Republicans know that they benefit more politically from allowing this crisis to fester at huge human cost only because it benefits them politically. It appeals to their racist political base, and they will continue to exploit it. Well, a week ago, Trump accepted the resignation of his labor secretary, Alex Acosta, related to the Epstein scandal. And today we learned that he is likely to name Eugene Scalia to run the Labor Department. Scalia is the son of the arch-conservative Supreme Court justice who died and put in motion the game of musical chairs that denied Merrick Garland a seat on the court and led to Gorsuch being nominated by Bush. And back in by Trump. Well, the reason I confuse that is that during the George W. Bush administration, the junior Scalia, Eugene Scalia, was a top lawyer in the Labor Department, and he has a very clear record that is hostile to the interests of workers in this country. Also, speaking of labor, there is a dispute underway inside the Bernie Sanders campaign, the only unionized campaign that I'm aware of in the presidential sweepstakes for 2020. And they're trying to negotiate a deal, and the first contract was rejected by the workers. And my old pal Faz Shakir, who is the campaign manager for the Sanders for President effort, he says that he is committed to the collective bargaining process and that they're not going to deviate from that, but that he was disappointed that the first package was rejected. And when you drill into it, some people are being asked to work for wages that would fall below $15 an hour. And the workers are asking for minimum pay of about $45,000 for field workers, field organizers, $62,000 for regional field directors. And health insurance is also an issue in the compensation packages for members of the Sanders campaign team. Here in San Francisco, I'm pleased to report that the First Amendment crisis that was triggered when the police department misled judges into issuing warrants against a journalist as they were investigating the leak of a police report on the death this past spring of our public defender, Jeff Adachi. And I've covered this in some detail in the past. I'll just tell you that the judge recognized that she had not been told that the gentleman in question, Brian Carmody, was a journalist who had a police department-issued press pass, and so she quashed the search warrant, meaning that the products of that search cannot be used in any criminal proceedings. And finally today, for your weekend read, may I recommend a piece by Evan Greer. He is the Deputy Director of Fight for the Future, the digital rights group behind a new website called banfacialrecognition.com. And his piece, published at BuzzFeed today, notes that San Francisco, Oakland, and I believe the town of, is it Somerville or Somerset? Yes, Somerville, Massachusetts. They have all passed ordinances banning the use of facial recognition by their governments, including the police departments. And this strikes a nerve with me because on my vacation in Europe, I was forced to supply fresh photos of my face to Germany, to Canada, and to the United States. Now, the one about as I was processed into the United States, that actually occurred in Canada. They offer you the option to have a fresh picture taken, but they don't actually tell you that you can opt out of it. And I found that in some ways, I'm not proud of this, but I submit rather than draw further attention to myself. And now that I'm thinking about it, I'm going to further link beyond this BuzzFeed commentary to a piece that I saw at The Intercept while I was on vacation, an American reporter who was subjected to a very intrusive investigation when he landed in Austin, Texas, after returning from a reporting assignment in Mexico. And his incident caused me to assume as low a profile as possible during my contacts with various immigration authorities on this trip. But I recommend the piece. It is very strong. Academics have called facial recognition, the use of artificial intelligence to pick out and identify individuals from vast databases, the most uniquely dangerous surveillance mechanism ever invented, and he calls for an outright ban on the use of this technology. And I believe that it is warranted. I don't expect the call to be heeded, because the people who benefit from surveillance, in terms of control of the population, the people who profit from surveillance, they have, shall we say, outsized sway in our political system today, and it's probably going to stay that way. Have a great weekend. Keep cool. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You can share it with absolutely everyone. You'll find it on YouTube. And I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling